In this video, I'm going to briefly discuss a new paper, a preprint by myself and two collaborators on improving the data presentation of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. So there are many problems with the way that the Centers for Disease Control in the United States presents data on influenza, pneumonia, and COVID-19, which are now being combined into a single category called PIC. This is an example here, one of the most extreme anomalies, if you will, in their data. Here we have the table of leading causes of deaths from the CDC, which lists deaths from different causes. And here we have influenza and pneumonia. It assigns in 2017 2%, and in 2016 1.9% of total deaths in the country to influenza and pneumonia as the cause of death. However, if we look at the FluView site, which has evolved into a FluView COVID site, in fact, this is an example. The scary red line is the percentage. See here, percent of all deaths due to PNI, which is pneumonia and influenza. And according to this data, according to this graph, it varies from 6 to 8 and even more percent over the years. Notice this is 2016 and 2017. Those are the same years covered in this leading causes of death report, but the same pattern exists for many years prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is a long-standing discrepancy in the tracking of pneumonia and influenza deaths. And I'll briefly discuss why this probably occurs. Now, this is just one of many examples of improper practices or confusing practices, things that do not follow common scientific and engineering practice in the pneumonia, influenza, and now COVID-19 numbers, data, documents, etc. And I'm going to focus on that particular area. There are issues with other parts of the CDC's data as well, but these are the ones I've studied extensively. And let me now show. So this is the paper, which is available on the Authorea website currently. Improving CDC data practices, recommendations for improving the United States Centers for Disease Control, CDC, data practices for pneumonia, influenza, and COVID-19. And this is the abstract here. And this is the actual paper. You can download it. It's a PDF, an Adobe PDF document, if you want to go into detail. It's quite lengthy. We go into a lot of details on a lot of different issues. I'm just going to highlight a few of them in a little bit more detail. I start with these discrepancies that I just outlined in tracking pneumonia and influenza deaths. And there are similar things between the CDC excess deaths, has files which give a much smaller number of pneumonia and influenza deaths, the green numbers here, going back several years, versus the FluView, the red numbers. And FluView has evolved into a site for tracking pneumonia, influenza, and COVID-19. And you can see that there's a large discrepancy. And here is a better shot of the FluView pneumonia and influenza mortality plot. The scary red line is the percentage of all deaths due to pneumonia and influenza. That's PNI. And this screenshot was taken on June 9th, 2021. And again, you can see it varies from 6% to 8% and even shoots up in some years to 10, 11%. Higher numbers. Much, much higher than the leading causes of death numbers. And here's a bigger close-up. This is the same one I showed before. You can see the whole thing. But when we look at influenza and pneumonia, which is the 8th leading causes of death according to this report, it has only 2% or 1.9% in 2017 and 2016. And it gives a specific number, which is exact to the last digit of the number of deaths supposedly due to influenza and pneumonia, which is 55,672 in 2017. And actually, if you look in the data files that produce the FluView graph, you'll see about 188,000 deaths attributed to influenza and pneumonia, or pneumonia and influenza. And there's no qualifications to this, so it sounds as if they're talking about the same thing, but they differ by a factor of over 3. The probable reason for that is the concept of an underlying cause of death, which is supposedly the fundamental cause of death. It has a technical definition, and that is what is used in the leading cause of death, according to the technical notes in the CDC documentation. It's really buried in the fine print. In contrast, if you look buried in the fine print for this, which sounds like it's talking about exactly the same thing, it appears to be talking about where pneumonia and influenza are a cause of death. It can be a contributing factor to death, but not, quote, the cause of death, the underlying cause of death. And this relates to this question of the exactitude of these numbers. In fact, the assignment of an underlying cause of death is uncertain, actually, and there are many studies showing that in different hospitals and different scientific groups and so forth. So these numbers should not actually be quoted as precise. They should have error bars on them. They should use significant figures and or actual errors saying that this is only known to a certain level. According to some papers, determining pneumonia as a cause of death is actually rather uncertain. So this is one example of many cases and places where the CDC data does not follow common scientific and engineering practice. It doesn't report systematic and statistical errors on it. It does not make proper use of significant figures, and I discuss that in detail here. And there are a number of cases where it's unclear what things refer to, as in, for example, these two numbers. There's nothing to indicate that they're different, which is not what you should do. Here's yet another source of confusion, which is that in addition to the flu view numbers and the leading causes of death numbers, the CDC has a model, which it doesn't document very well. It's very unclear what they're doing, which attributes deaths specifically to the influenza virus. So there are many different viruses like the coronaviruses and others out there, many different bacteria, many different things that can cause death, pneumonias, respiratory illness, and death. But the CDC claims that it's specifically the influenza virus, for which there is a vaccine, that virus is responsible for a disproportionate and much higher number of deaths than is shown by laboratory tests. So laboratory tests of deaths typically show around maybe 6,000 deaths where the influenza virus is actually detected out of the, say, 55,000 or so in the leading causes of death, and presumably the 188,000 or so in the flu view numbers. So that's very confusing, and it's often unclear what these things are. There are many places where it's unclear whether something you're looking at is a model output, an estimate, a guess. An estimate is an educated guess. A raw data count, like a count of death certificates, or whether the count has been adjusted in some way to try to compensate for undercounting or other problems. And the language is often very confusing. And it is worth noting that these numbers for influenza and pneumonia have in various ways been seriously criticized by a number of people for years. One prominent critic is Peter Doshi, who's currently a professor at the University of Maryland and is senior editor of the British Medical Journal, BMJ, and he has written several articles specifically on these numbers going back many years. His Ph.D. thesis at MIT was about these numbers from the CDC and problems with them. So it's not a new problem. It's been noted by other people. It does not seem to have been resolved or really fixed despite many years of criticism. There are many other issues. I'm not going to go through them all here. You can read the abstract and so forth. This is the excess deaths, which again is a complicated issue actually. The black plus signs are supposedly the weekly deaths in the last year or so, and these different colored lines represent predictions from previous data that the CDC has of what you might expect to see in a normal year. So these excess deaths are often attributed to the COVID pandemic, although they could be caused by the reaction to the COVID pandemic. They could even possibly be grossly misleading, depending on what exactly how these numbers are counted. The white line here is actually pretty close to what CDC is doing. It uses the same parameters as CDC. As you can see, there's significant variation. So we can get estimates ranging from as low as, let's see what the lowest one is here, about 389,000 excess deaths, to a number like the CDC has, which is about 500,000 deaths as of when this plot was produced in June, or actually May. Now, the CDC doesn't report all this complexity, and that there are large systematic modeling errors in estimating the excess deaths. That's another example of something they do that we recommend that they not do. They do something like this, or maybe even better than what I'm doing here. Um, I don't discuss years of life lost right now, but that's important as well. And something else that happened is that the death certification rules for COVID are very different from those historically used for influenza and pneumonia, which were generally considered not to be the underlying cause of death, to be either a cause of death or a contributing factor in the presence of pre-existing conditions. So that's a major issue in interpreting the data. So, for example, pneumonia would be considered a complication, not the underlying cause of death, if the person already has dementia, cerebrovascular disease, cardiac disease, lung disease. And that would include what's called COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is a fancy category primarily for chronic bronchitis and emphysema. The vast majority of cases and deaths with COPD, either due to COPD or where it's considered a contributing cause, are people who have emphysema or chronic bronchitis, which is a degenerative condition, usually in old age, where your breathing gets poorer, and it often ends with a case of pneumonia or a cold or something like that. Now, these used to be assigned to the underlying disease. So these are the type of comorbidities that they talk about in COVID, which are now considered contributing factors and not the underlying cause of death. So COVID is being treated differently. The SARS-CoV-2 virus is actually being treated differently from other viruses in the past. So that makes it difficult, perhaps impossible, to compare the COVID-19 death numbers to previous years. Should they be compared to the 55,000 number from the leading causes of death? Should they be compared to the 188,000 or so deaths from the flu or from something else? Because there are also other non-respiratory underlying causes of death, ischemic heart disease, for example, that in the past would have been considered the underlying cause of death and now would be a contributing cause only for COVID. So it's very complicated, and many of these technical issues are not handled well by the CDC and are a source of, at best, confusion. And anyone with a good knowledge of common scientific and engineering practice would really wonder about this stuff. So we end by making many recommendations to improve the quality of the data, make it consistent with common scientific and engineering practice, such as reporting statistical errors, systematic errors, confidence limits for all the numbers, being clear on what is a raw count of data like death certificates, an adjusted count, and what is an estimate coming from a model. This issue of exactly what the difference is between the leading causes of death reports, pneumonia and influenza deaths, and the flu site should be clearly clarified in the immediate vicinity of or in the graphics, not in the fine print, so it's clear. Ideally, they should have some sort of different names that clarify that they are actually two different things, which they must be to be so different. They differ by a factor of over 3. Systematic modeling problems or errors should also be reported, which can be done by fitting different models to the data and seeing how different the results are. In fact, the models that are used for the excess deaths, for extrapolating how many deaths you might expect to see, say, in 2020, those models are basically simple trend extrapolation models. It's questionable whether they should be applied to this data, and there are lots of different trend estimation models which give actually different results, as I showed in the plot before. All models should be, the source code should be available. It should be easy for people to download and run on their computers, and we can go on. One other thing is interesting is that who has died in the United States is not publicly available. The government has a file or a database called the Deaths Master File, but it is not available through the Freedom of Information Act. It's not even available to the IRS, amazingly enough. This is the reason that something in excess of 1 million stimulus checks in the early, about June of 2020, were mailed to dead people, because the IRS does not have access to the full Deaths Master File. The reasons for that are explained in the ostensible reasons for that are explained in this paper, or at least what's publicly claimed. So the result is that even other agencies, let alone independent researchers or the general public who might have concerns about these numbers, there's no way to actually audit them and verify these counts of deaths actually correspond to at least what's in the Deaths Master File. If you had the Deaths Master File, which includes the names and dates and other information on deaths, you could then spot check them. You could randomly check a few thousand or something of the people in it and verify that at least those people actually died as the Death Master file reports. There actually have been people put in it, something like 1,000 per month in previous audits, who were alive. So it's not perfect. The system is not perfect. And again, the errors are not reported in any of the CDC, or very little of the CDC's numbers and documents don't report these errors, or even and also don't explain where they're coming from. And then there's a large number of references to back up what we're saying here. There's a lot of technical issues in trying to understand these numbers. And it's not at all surprising that people who are directed to the CDC by Google, by the government, they say, oh, don't listen to these other people, go listen to the authorities. But of course, if you try to make sense of what they're telling you, as opposed to trusting the headlines, the topic lines on the web pages and documents, if you actually drill down and try to make sense of what they're saying, you find this morass, which does not follow common scientific and engineering practice, is confusing. Much of the language is confusing, doesn't report errors, and many other things. So anyone who's really thinking critically is going to look at this and have pretty strong doubts about what they're being told. And so let me just meander back, not meander, but return to the original article and remind you that you can find gross anomalies. This is one of the larger ones in this data. These are not small things. They're not explained in any clear way. You have to kind of guess what the fine print is telling you, if that is actually what it means. So if you really want to get a deep dive into this, which I do recommend, you can read our paper. And you can also kind of skim through it and just look at the abstract and look at the recommendations. But it's much easier to understand the recommendations if you've actually read the paper. And that concludes this video. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.